Hey, I'm going on a tour of the United Kingdom. If you've ever been interested in that big question of God's existence, or tried to make sense of religion in the 21st century, or consciousness, or anything philosophical, then join me on stage as I try to work out some of these topics with you. I'll be in conversation with a good friend, but also bring questions because there will be an extensive Q&A, and maybe even an opportunity to hear and rate some of your philosophical hot takes. The tour dates are on screen, the link to buy tickets is in the description, and I hope to see you there. David Bentley Hart, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The pre-Socratic philosopher Thales is said by, I think, both Plato and Aristotle to have claimed that all things are full of gods. You chose this phrase as the title of your second most recent book, and I suppose a good place to start is, what do you think Thales meant by that?
Actually, I have no idea what Thales meant by that. I know what I meant by stealing it, but in the case of Thales, I will say this. It reflects, obviously, a vision of the cosmos that's not mechanistic, obviously, and that's why I chose it. My contention throughout the book is that there is in the workings of nature, there is of necessity a kind of intentionality and a kind of consciousness that's primordial. And I tend to think that this was, in some ways, better intuited in ages when people thought that gods or daemons or demones or spirits inhabited nature, and it might have been understood in a largely pictorial way as nymphs and naiads and nereids or whatever, but I think it reflects a more insightful view of the way nature works than what became increasingly the default view after the 17th century in the West of a mechanistic and either haunted or utterly eliminativist reality.
I wonder, my listeners will know that for some time I've been discussing the idea of mind as fundamental and materialism, not accounting for things like consciousness, or maybe not even accounting for anything. But I suppose just one thing that we haven't really covered in detail on this show is the historical trajectory, so to speak. So maybe briefly it might be helpful if you can tell me what you think happened with the development of the scientific method to sort of rid the world of this mental agency and mathematize the whole surroundings of us.
Well, it was a perfectly honorable project in the 17th century in some ways. In other ways, not. I mean, when Leibniz speaks of putting nature on the rack, or Bacon speaks of knowledge as a path to mastery of nature, you can see the seeds of all the most destructive aspects of modernity and capitalism and the culture we now inhabit, in which the world really has been reduced in many ways in our minds to, not an endless, but a vast reservoir of resources to be exploited by the will and for consumerist ends. But it began more humbly, simply as an attempt, obviously, to create a working inductive method that didn't presume more than it could conclude from the evidence. And so it tried to prescind from the Aristotelian fourfold nexus of causality, especially with formal and final causality. And by that time, I should point out, already Aristotle had begun to be misconstrued as somebody who had created a defective mechanical model. Already what he meant by atia was being, and what the school meant by causae was now being thought of already in terms rather like what we mean by causality, that is the energetic exchange between objects in motion. But it was an attempt to prescind, and in so doing, to banish from our picture of nature anything that had the characteristics of mind or spirit, that is, the things that we could presume from our own experience of ourselves, having a purposiveness or a formal causality, and all of that was segregated into a separate space. And so, of course, the age of the mechanical philosophy began as a kind of dualism in which nature is mechanical and mindless. Mind is like a resident ghost, Gilbert Ryle's phrase, the ghost in the machine. And it was simply assumed that the two could, just exist in an amicable divorce under some sort of regime, some sort of occasionalism in which perhaps the two acted in harmony, or under some obscure occult form of causality, as in Descartes, in which the mind, being utterly unlike mechanism or res extensa, nonetheless can exert effects. And I'm quite happy, having no pretense of being able, therefore, to understand mind or spirit or God or whatever, or the soul in mechanistic terms. Two problems, though, of course, quickly emerged. One was that you really can't perfect pure induction. It's, as a method, it's an ideal, but it's not actually a practice. So always some degree of, always some question of, especially in the life sciences, even to this day, one asks, what is it for? And trying to understand some aspect of an organism. But nonetheless, it was like wearing tinted spectacles so you could see certain things and not others, and understand natural processes in terms of machine processes. But of course, scientific ambition is necessarily omnivorous. It wants to understand everything, so it soon did turn to the phenomena of mental life. The problem is you have a model then that exists solely by virtue of the exclusion of mental phenomena from our picture of nature. And then using that model, an attempt was being made to understand mental phenomena, which leads, and I'm taking a long time to say this, invariably to the sort of diffuse materialist strategies we have now, like eliminativism, which is the most consistent and the most insane at the same time. Other forms of reductionism, supervenience, being sort of middle position, emergentism, none of which I think really holds water. So,
yeah, I was trying to find a direct quote from the text, because I remember you speaking quite powerfully about specifically this idea that the modern scientific method comes about by removing this phenomenological aspect. It sort of focuses on, I mean, if you ask a scientist, what's the point of science? They might say something like, well, it's an attempt to move away from our subjective assessments of the world. I'm looking at this table and you're looking at this table. So what we want to do is look at the table from a third-person perspective. And we want to say, what is this table like really doing? What's it actually made out of? Not according to me or according to you. But consciousness itself is the first person. That's what consciousness means. It means to sort of be this first-person experiential kind of state. And so you speak a bit, and of course the text is, of course, in a dialogue, in that sort of celebrated philosophical tradition of dialogue.
It's a very self-indulgent book for those who haven't read it.
But I think it's a wonderful format, and there's a reason why philosophers have done it for so long. Although I saw an internet meme, like a joke, the other day about like how philosophers will talk about how wonderful the philosophical dialectic is, and then in reality it was just like this wall of text, and then one of Socrates' opponents going like, "Indubitably so, Socrates."
Yes, well, that's inevitable, I'm afraid. I tried to avoid that. I actually tried to give Hephaestus his own voice.
I think you've done quite a good job of doing so. But what I wanted to ask you was specifically this idea of the third-person perspective of science. You write in this dialogue form, but I suspect it's your own personal view that there is no such thing. What is this third-person perspective that science seeks to discover?
Well, it's a curious thing. In fact, it's a maxim of method that has become inverted almost into a metaphysical premise by some Daniel Dennett, probably most obviously. I will not speak ill of him now, De Mortuis and all that. And he was a brilliant man. He was just wrong about a great number of things, I think. But the third-person method says, yes, not only moving away from subjectivity, but moving away from the structure of subjectivity and trying to impose it on nature. Presumably, then we can step back and achieve a vantage on a phenomenon that doesn't bear the impress of our own personality or will or longing. But this consists in, of course, an accumulation of other reports and trying to sort through them. And it does seem to be something that's sort of systematically forgotten, that the third person perspective as such does not exist. The third person perspective is itself a distillation of first person perspectives. And so in trying to understand what it is we're seeing in this view from nowhere, the scientific image, as Wilfred Sellers called it, rather than the manifest image, we never actually get away from having to examine what the conditions of the manifest image are at the first person level. And then trying to do that, I mean, as with Dennett, you can end up with saying, the appearance of intentionality is something that we attribute to other things and to ourselves when we're taking the intentional stance. There's a heroic, Herculean effort there to make the self an object of a third-person perspective rather than acknowledge that the third-person perspective is based on that first-person perspective, to the point that he could say, I am attributing intentionality to myself when I'm looking at myself from an intentional vantage, which obviously is an infinite regress in the making. Again, a perfectly honorable thing to do, and at the humblest level of methodological abstention, and asceticism and discipline, it's a good practice. But when it becomes absolute and changes from method to metaphysics and changes from a limited method to a conviction about the shape of reality itself, you're doing nothing other than what you're accusing those who rely on subjectivity of doing. You're simply taking your subjective impression under the form of, in the somewhat dissembling form of, a perfectly disinterested and perfectly detached third-person perspective.
I find it really helpful to speak in analogy when trying to get this idea across, and there are all sorts. One of the best that I've come across is this idea of the aeroplane, and that you can fly an airplane blind because you just have all of this instrumentation which measures your velocity and your height, the air pressure outside and stuff like that, and it kind of represents it on graphs and in sort of mathematical formula. I don't know what a plane really looks like, but it's all there on the dashboard. And this is kind of a method
You don't have a
we
pilot
use.
license?
Unfortunately not, although
I
I
thought
don't have a
everyone
driver's
did.
license either. I thought it would be
Oh,
funnier
well,
to...
that takes me
I know
back to life
someone...
in Britain, actually knowing people without driver's
Yes.
licenses. It must be very
There's just...
soothing.
It would be more of a hindrance than anything, especially in London. I know someone who got their pilot's license before their driver's license because, that's just what it's like to live in England. But even in a car, you have these representations. You have the speedometer, and we find these sort of useful ways to a sort of useful method to understand what's going on outside. But it would be this insane mistake to kind of forget that we've come up with that description, to help us navigate the world, and think that the description there is the actual world, that outside of the airplane there just exists like a speedometer and, this various set of instrumentation.
But this is, of course, the problem with method in general. On the one hand, what you're saying is something that, say, I don't know why I keep mentioning Dennett, I guess just because I have a beard like his now and going bald and looking more like him every day, is he would say, yes, the user interfaces that are sort of evolutionarily determined algorithms by which we navigate a terrain that otherwise would be impossible for us because we wouldn't be able to move down into the systems and subsystems of it. So when we go for a walk, we're not consciously operating our tendons and our nerves and our sinews. It's when that, and we all acknowledge that, even before Kant, we're aware that there's a realm of representation that, if not, again, it doesn't necessarily dissemble, but also doesn't necessarily reveal. It allows us to operate in a world that would be impossible for us if it were just a one-to-one correspondence between our neurology and the complexity of sensible data out there. But then, having said that, you have to recognize that the user interface is on that side of an economy, which on the other side is still and I don't want to just speak of consciousness, it's the totality of the activity of mind, consciousness, intentionality, unity of perspective. And to say that too is a user interface available to, and Dennett would always resist the notion of the Cartesian theater and say, there's not one. There are multiple drafts of knowledge. There's not one panoptic central module, and yet invariably he ended up talking that way anyway. Sooner or later, there was always this occult figure there of the one for whom there is an intentional stance, of the one who is using the user illusion. And so method, whenever, and it's not just materialists, of course, obviously anyone who employs a method with such strict fidelity and such absolute credulity that the method becomes your metaphysics or becomes your ontology, sooner or later you're going to end up in absurdity. And I think at least the forms of materialist reduction we have for mental agency have been uniformly absurd. Whether some sort of, say, panpsychism or other that's more plausible than, say, integrated information theory, which I don't think works at all, could come along. I don't know, because I have problems with that as well, at least in its modern forms. But what we're talking about, it's not an accusation heaped just at materialists. This is the problem of method whenever we mistake our method for the reality of what we're using it to try to get a perspective on.
Yeah, another area that sometimes crops up is in quantum mechanics. The so-called Copenhagen interpretation is also known as the shut up and calculate approach, right, which is to say we have this mathematical model of, probability distributions and the collapse of the wave function, and as long as the maths work, we'll just say that's what's really going on, when the critique for many people of this interpretation is to say, well, that's a great model, that's a great way to make predictions about quantum mechanics, but to say that's actually what it is a little bit crazy. And I think they're right in saying so. And it's a similar kind of mistake that's being made here, perhaps.
I would say so, yes. Mind you, I prefer the Copenhagen interpretation to, say, the Everettian. I'm sort of drawn to the notion of decoherence because that has a kind of fascinating ontological shape to it that you can negotiate in terms of measurement of the perspective of the measure and all that. But on the whole, yes, the Copenhagen interpretation at least leaves us. Niels Bohr was right about that. That you have the predictive apparatus in place. But he, and Schrödinger too, would say, do not mistake this for the really real. Okay, don't do that.
Yes. Quite, yeah. Some people forget that Schrödinger's cat is supposed to be a reductio ad absurdum.
Right.
You're not supposed to actually believe the cat is dead and alive. You're supposed to believe that, this is the ludicrous sort of outcome of believing that the method is the metaphysical truth.
This is the fate of Eddie Allen.
Yeah. We'll get back to the show in just a moment, but first, if you're anything like me, getting the right kind of food in your diet can be a bit of a challenge. There's quite a lot of vitamins and minerals and nutrients to keep on top of. And for me, when I'm struggling with this, it's today's sponsor, Huel, that comes to the rescue. Take a look at this bottle. You're looking at 400 calories, 35 grams of vegan protein, and 26 vitamins and minerals. In other words, this is a complete meal. This is the high-protein black edition. I like it in the classic chocolate flavor, but it comes in chocolate peanut butter, vanilla, strawberry banana, iced latte. There'll be something to suit your taste. It's high-protein, low sugar, and low cost, coming in on average at under $3 per meal. Go to huel.com/Alex O'Connor, and if you use the code Alex O'Connor at checkout as a new customer, you'll also get 15% off. Complete nutrition while saving your time and your money. With that said, back to the show. Yes, quite. On that point, then, we've used a few words so far, one of which is like mechanistic or material, and the kind of mind-first metaphysics that you have and I am increasingly becoming susceptible to is often posed against this mechanistic, naturalistic, physicalist, whatever sort of term you want to use. And yet, the question that I always find it difficult to even begin answering is, what is that thing? Like when we say mechanistic or a universe that's just made of like inert matter, like what are we talking about? What is that picture of the universe? And I ask you because even though it's not your view, your book is in many ways an exercise in steel manning the opposition because you have different characters holding different views.
Yeah, no, and I did try to be honest about that with Hephaestus. I didn't want to make him a straw man, and in part because I have some sympathy for his skepticism regarding how much you can actually conclude, and more because I have sympathy for his problem of evil meditations at the end of the book. But yeah, as I say, it began merely as a matter of method. That is, you can isolate processes in nature without presuming you know what their final cause would be in Aristotelian terms. Not even necessarily assuming that there isn't such a thing, but they're just they have to be banished from method as ghostly distractions from the phenomenon before you, supposedly. And in that act of isolation, you learn a great deal. I mean, so much of modern medicine and all of the rest of our technology comes from this shut up and calculate, or shut up and chart out the circulation of the blood. And so we should be grateful for this. But what quickly accumulated around it like an impenetrable panoply was this vision of reality as nothing but the mindless exchange of energetic forces between masses in objects, mass forms, quanta of mass in motion. Okay. Now, again, as with Schrödinger, for instance, Galileo was misunderstood on this when he said, the realm of the sciences is the realm of the calculable, which is this realm of absolute quantities, not qualities, therefore not of color and taste, and so all the things that we experience as reality and what are called the semantics of reality as opposed to its bare mathematical syntax. And Galileo wasn't saying, again, that this is reality as such. He was saying this is what the sciences can learn to calculate, because measurement was the great thing. And I think we fail to understand how much of early modern science was the discovery of the absoluteness of measurement. But that picture then becomes such that by the time, with Descartes, for instance, and having a very restricted notion, nothing like the ancient sort of multifarious, multi-layered view of what spirit or mind is or how it interacts with the material order, we have a realm of just pure mechanism and a realm of pure soul. And souls are sort of monads that have all the characteristics that we attribute to ourselves, including reason and discursive powers and all that. So anywhere where any of those powers are lacking, therefore, everything, the power to perceive qualities, the power to have sensation or even no pain. And so animals are treated as machines. Well, right there, of course, we see something that's obviously horribly untrue, which led to abominable practices of cruelty with an easy conscience. But anyone who hasn't been bedazzled by this mistaking of method for metaphysics or for an ontology can see the pain that an animal suffers, can see the joy it experiences. And right there, that should apprise us that this mechanistic view of nature, at least in either reducing mind to this sort of pure monad that accounts for every aspect of subjectivity and agency, and matter in the material realm is just pure mindless matter, already has a destructive effect, not only to the sanity of our vision, because we're denying what's evident and obvious, but also because it leads to incredible license. It at once gives us power over nature and a sense of license to use it as we will. And sooner or later, this will, of course, translate itself into a way of seeing humankind as well. Even we saw that in the 20th century, how much of the special evils of the 20th century, there's special evils in every century, I'm not doing a comparison here, but had to do with seeing all of nature and all of humanity as a technology, a genetic technology, a racial technology, an economic, a political technology, to be corrected, to be re-engineered, to be redesigned. And we see it still now in some of the more lurid fantasies that come out of Silicon Valley and other insane asylums.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you say, you contrast mindless, fundamental reality. So the universe is made out of sort of mindless stuff. How do you envision what that stuff looks like to the materialist? Just like a bunch of little tiny marbles, little physical matter that doesn't have any kind of mental agency?
Well, even when they deny it, that is in fact what they're seeing. They're 17th century revisions of Democritus. They're atomists
Hmm.
who sort of see the universe as the fortuitous result of an especially complex billiards game, and or pool. We don't really play billiards in this country,
Yes.
but billiards is more interesting. So, um, and one of the curious things about Daniel Dennett, for instance, to keep reverting to him, maybe it's because he can't defend himself now, so it's a cheap shot. Is that as much as he would try to stay at the cutting edge of things like molecular biology, and he was quite good at understanding it. I too am a dabbler in these things, and I know how hard it is to stay abreast of science. And he was extremely bright in that way. But he still, when he began to apply philosophical conclusions, he kept coming back to mechanistic prejudices. Now, they may have become more cybernetic in grammar. That is, he would talk about robots rather than threshing machines, and he saw computational models of mind, which I believe to be just total category errors. He saw these as sort of deflationary pictures of what mental processes are in us, and so that our subjective states are like the icons on the computer screen. They're just algorithmic distillates that we use as the data processing engines we are, and the syntactic engines of our brains having become semantic engines. We use them in a way that looks like intentionality to someone who goes unnamed. But I do think there's and even quantum mechanics hasn't done much to change that. I mean, those who are strict materialists will often talk almost magically about the quantum realm, as if, I think Alex Rosenberg's a good example. He uses it as proof, mechanistic proof of a kind, that the principle of sufficient reason doesn't hold because particles spring into existence and can only in a way that can only be statistically accounted for, not locally accounted for, right? But he seems to fail to realize this happens within a quantum field that has rather, if it has laws, rather mysterious laws of its own. So it's a bad argument, but it's indicative that he's seeing even quantum mechanics as somehow enfolded into this coarser mechanistic picture. So I think in their most unreflective moments, which unfortunately are the moments that get translated into their actual philosophical conclusions, they are still thinking that way. They are still thinking about little billiard balls, and why so many of them can take something like the computer game of life and how it generates complex patterns through a few simple rules within a quarantined virtual topography of discrete cells. They see that as somehow telling us something about the integrated, organic, creative processes of biology, which it seems to me they obviously don't, and especially neither at the level of the organism nor at the level of the phenotype, of the genotype of its evolution. I'd say there's a lot of a kind of, I don't want to say superstition. Well, I do actually. It's a superstition. They still have this picture, even when they're sophisticated enough at other moments to know that it's a crude sketch.
Now, a view that's often levied against, I don't know if there's a good word for like idealists, panpsychists, pantheists, like any sort of mind first people. A criticism that sometimes, that would do.
Theism would be an obvious category there. Yes.
Yeah, well, I want to get to that. But in fact, as a means to getting there, I kind of wanted to ask like about this accusation that's sometimes posed, which is like, okay, fair enough. So, look, the scientific method is a method, and it might be a mistake to assume that, that is our metaphysics. But the fact that that's a mistake isn't enough to say that it definitely isn't the metaphysic, and it also isn't enough, even if it did do that, it isn't enough to say, therefore, it must be like mind at the foundation of reality. And some people get the impression that there's this kind of idealism of the gaps, where people are saying like, we know that consciousness is there, and we know that science doesn't
Sometimes
offer a good metaphysics, so let's put consciousness in there. But we want to avoid that, right? So could you tell us how we get from where we are now to like the actual case for like the metaphysical truth?
Well, sometimes, in fact, you do get an idealism of the gaps. Of course, you get a materialism of the gaps too. I mean, emergence is a magic word in materialism,
Yes.
and trying to get past the conceptual difference between weak or structural emergence and strong emergence, and the way the two are sort of merged without commentary in a way that doesn't make sense. But yeah, there is an idealism of the gaps. But that's in the book we're discussing, I tried to do just the opposite, which was to say that
Yes.
when we attend to the phenomena of mind, of life, and of language, those are the three topics of the book, and I take them to be one and the same problem, actually, for a materialist metaphysics. It's not enough just to say, or it's not only enough to say that the materialist narrative is defective. It's also not enough to do what, say, the intelligent design people do and speak of irreducible complexities, because they're still thinking in terms of mechanical complexities in which, yes, there's an intentional agency, but they just think that's of a sort of like a higher order, in the same way that I could design a computer, perhaps, if I knew how to do that. I can't even fix a toaster, but if I could, I could then go on to argue that evolution has forged me as a system that is mechanical to, simply saying that these orders of complexity look designed from outside also isn't sufficient. The issue that's interesting is the nature of the order. Is it an order that really can be shown to be top down in an irreducible way and at an original and primordial level? Now, I don't believe that you can rest content with the terminal dualism. You can't just say, well, there is a power of mind and there's a power of matter, because this is an old metaphysical quandary, of course. If they can interact at all, that means there's some ontological context of non-repugnancy that they share in common that still has to be looked at as the more original principle. So for me, a dualism doesn't work at any number of levels, but especially it doesn't work as an explanatory model. But when we get to the issue of actually looking at what mind does, and whether not only whether it's compatible with the mechanical narrative, or whether in fact it demands something more like, well, the Aristotelian model is a good example. I'm not like a Thomist who's just, dogmatic Aristotelian. So anyone, just throw the word out like formal causality. But nonetheless, the etiology that Aristotle developed was not an attempt at a mechanical explanation of how different forces converge to create natural forms. Rather, it's a set of rational relations that are mind-like. Now, the question is that just a representation? Is Kant right that we're just totally limited to that apparatus? Or is Hegel right in saying, well, no, even the ability to recognize representation as a limitation means we've already got a rational power of going beyond it and recognizing a more prior condition? And I agree with Hegel that, that there's something fundamentally incoherent in proclaiming the nature of a limit that you can't get past. Because if you can't get past it, you shouldn't be able to understand its nature. You don't know what it's limiting you from. All right. But, and just saying Ding an sich, well, that in itself is already an assertion about ontology and manifestation, right? So we look at the phenomena around us, what mind does, and try to construct a narrative and find that in many ways, it seems to rest entirely on itself. Consciousness has an infuriating quality that, everyone from Aristotle to Brentano and Husserl agonized over, or at least noted. I don't know if Aristotle agonized over it. We don't really have his dialogues. We only have the lecture notes. But that consciousness is instantly recursive. Consciousness is only consciousness because it's conscious of itself being conscious. So if you're trying to, say, reduce this to a mechanistic narrative, one module proprioceptively looking at a larger module as part of, you do get an infinite regress of causes. Whereas if you do something more like what Schelling did, or what Kashmiri Shaivite philosophers did, understanding that, or in Vedanta, supremely Adi Shankaracharya, recognizing that consciousness itself is its own premise and rests upon itself, that you avoid that sort of this is just one argument among hundreds of it. But the same is true with intentionality. Intentionality, always, when you look at it carefully, has both a transcendental or remote and within the compass of which more proximate ends are desired. And again, how do you square that with the materialist narrative? When you look at it, you find that there's always this prior purpose to having a purpose. But then you can get much more concrete than that. I mean, all these movements in the life sciences in recent years have been attempts, like systems biology and processual biology and Dennis Noble's biological relativity and all that, honest attempts to get in touch with the sort of hierarchical structure of life in which there seem to be not only infrangible composites, like, at the lowest level, nucleic acids and proteins and things like that. Again, that's the intelligent design approach. But more than that, a whole system of intelligibility and coordinated activity, at the top of which there is a literally semiotic level, semantic and syntactic and symbolic symbolic thought being involved in it, in which there's an actual hermeneutical dynamism going on in first of all within an organism, how cells can re-edit their own genomes in coordination with one another, but how they pass information on to another generation, in which an RNA polymerase has to read it out from the DNA, and then it's reinscribed in the DNA. This is an interpretive activity. And then you have to say, well, this is more than just an analogy to language. This is doing what language does. And then you can look at the structure of language, and can you really reduce that to an evolutionary narrative that starts from a pre-linguistic, pre-semantic, pre-semiotic? And I think absolutely you cannot. Again, I would take up many hours arguing that, and so on and so forth. And one last thing I'll point out, when I talk about the life sciences, when you see one of the great biologists who was also a philosophical intellect, sort of the next generation after Polanyi, was Robert Rosen. And his book, Life Itself, actually was one of the books that really challenged my own sense of what I understood. I mean, it took me to a much deeper appreciation of, for him, the laws of life are fundamental, and the laws of physics are just limits conditions. So you cannot get to life starting with physics as your only canon of laws. Rather, you have to start with, and this is a rather radical proposal, but it makes sense. But if you follow that to its end, I think you're going to end up finding that you're back at formal and final causes, and structure of mind becomes the paradigm for understanding the structure of everything: language, life, and certainly the agency of mind. Now, I could go on, but as you know, it's a long book. So why I believe this?
Yes, it's a long book for a reason, and what I'm interested in doing is picking out areas that I think will be of particular interest to our listeners based on some of the conversations I've been recently having. So one question that you covered, but perhaps people will want a bit more detail on, is what's wrong with emergence? I mean, there is this view that, okay, it is a bit weird that the universe is made out of, material stuff, just a bunch of inert marbles that bump into each other, and that somehow you get things like the taste of Coca-Cola and the redness of red from their arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
But what's so funny about that, given that we have all kinds of processes which are not present in the fundamental part? The wetness of water is not present in the hydrogen and the oxygen. The sponginess of the cake, to borrow John Cottingham's example, isn't in any of the ingredients. None of the ingredients are spongy, but if you put them together in the right way, in the right temperature, you get sponginess. Why can't consciousness be something like that?
Oh, for the simple reason that again, that's what I was talking about earlier, the way the word emergence covers a multitude of sins. It also covers a gap. There are two kinds of emergence. The one you're talking about is obvious. it rationally follows not only from a materialist metaphysics, but any knowledge that composites do things that the individual ingredients don't do. We also know, however, that what composites do are structural amplifications of powers resident in the ingredients. So the wetness of water follows from the specific nature of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, and the way in which the combustible nature of either is negated in this combination. And you can see the molecular stacking. You understand that water is a physical extension of a physical process. And you'd say, well, okay, brain processes are the same thing. And brain processes may be. The structure of consciousness, however, to begin with, poses a very radically different sort. And this is where we get to strong emergence. And the most, again, as I say, the most consistent materialist position is sort of like that of Paul and Patricia Churchland and other eliminativists who want to say that everything is weak emergence if we could just understand, if we could just get rid of the folk lore of things like intrinsic intentional states. But you notice, in order to get to that, you have to not show how intrinsic intentional states arise from intrinsically non-intentional ingredients. You have to do away with intrinsic intentional states as illusory. And Dennett understood this. Rosenberg understands this. Because here we're talking about phenomena at a different level of, if you want to call it emergence, of emergence or of appearance. You can see it. I mean, I remember vividly, we don't even, again, I'm going to sound like an intelligent design theorist, but I remember vividly reading somebody defending the notion of emergence by two examples. One was the wetness of water. That seems to be everyone's favorite. Because, sure, it's counterintuitive that two combustible elements produce a viscosity that can extinguish flame. But the other was a computer, and how you couldn't reduce its functions to the arrangement of its parts. And of course, should be immediately obvious is that the two are these are discontinuous examples to begin with. So even if you want to do what I said earlier and reduce the designer of the computer down to his or her constituent parts, you're beginning there with a phenomenon that has been created by the impress of a form upon things that produces functions that only function fully at the hermeneutical level of a conscious and intending mind, because the physical activities on the screen have no intrinsic meanings, right?
Yeah.
What we've done is we've created a medium by which a different kind of causality, and we've created, first of all, a medium that required a real intentionality, and real intentionality is already an anomaly within a mechanistic narrative. It simply is, because it allows for finality to be a real, rational, and antecedent cause in the present. Not a mechanical cause, but a real rationale that determines the shape of things. But even when you get past that, you realize that what the computer is doing is not what the computer is doing. It's what an intentional agency at one end of a process and another intentionality at the other end of the process is doing in a hermeneutical space that does not exist at the material plane at all, or a noetic space where a finality and all of the ingredients of what go into the phenomenon that has this finality in this form exist already in a kind of ideal unity. So, idealism naturally is a sort of natural intuition to begin with. Well, the more you think about the structure of a language, the more you look at the structure of mind, but also the more you look at the structure of life, the harder and harder, almost to the point of vanishing away entirely, becomes the possibility of seeing it as a structural emergence. What a wheel does is a structural emergence of what the molecules in a wheel do. What a house does is not exactly a structural emergence of what the ingredients of a house do, but with the application of another intentional agency, you get a house. What the mind that's building that house is doing requires an intentionality that I would argue is so primordial, and again, so recursively infinite if reduced to material causes, as to be really impossible to reconcile with materialism. Again, though, emergence is a useful term because it's a qualifier. It's used as a univocity in order to cover over an analogy. Weak and strong emergence are two very different things. Structural emergence and a true strong emergence. So every once in a while you'll meet a materialist who will just say, okay, yes, I do believe in strong emergence. That's just the way reality works. And we see it at the quantum level. Particles just appear. Okay, so we're not really now talking in terms of scientific rationality that's trying to give an explanation of why this happens. We're just saying it happens. Two problems, again, as I mentioned earlier with Rosenberg, particles don't just appear. This isn't ex nihilo. This is within a quantum field. There are certain statistically predictable events. All right, and when you try to translate this out of that already very reductive and questionable understanding of quantum mechanics, what you basically have is magic. And I don't mind people believing in magic. I'm not a dogmatist regarding anyone's ontology. If you believe in magic, go for it. But don't call it science, and don't tell me that this is the more coherent ontology of mind than the other one.
I find it
or
quite...
Or of language.
Or of language, yes. I find... I mean, gets a bit sort of complicated, and we use some philosophical terminology when talking about strong emergence or weak emergence. One thing I like to point out, which I think gets at a similar point, but I wonder what you make of this, is that in all of the most sort of jarring instances of emergence, when I talk to people about consciousness and they say consciousness is emergent, just like the image on a screen is emergent from zeros and ones in a computer, or temperature is emergent from vibrations of atoms. Atoms aren't hot or cold, but if they vibrate all together, then you get this thing called temperature, which emerges. And it came from reading Thomas Nagel. He says something very, very briefly in like one sentence that suddenly sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, I don't know if this applies universally, but it seems to me that most of the time when someone gives an analogy for consciousness of something else which is emergent, that other thing which is emergent relies on the existence of consciousness to emerge. So temperature, for example, if all you mean by temperature is fast vibration of atoms, then nothing interesting has actually emerged. You've got individual atoms which vibrate very fast. You put lots of them together and you have an object which is made of really fast vibrating atoms. Nothing interesting has happened. If you want to say, no, but there's this new thing which is like heat. It's this thing called temperature, hot and cold. Well, that's something that you experience. You don't experience the vibration of the atoms. You experience this phenomenological, like, qualia, for want of a better word, of temperature. And so the thing that's emerged there, quale, is because it's singular.
Guard our Latin.
Yes, quite. That needs to be held to account. The thing that's emerged in that instance of temperature, the interesting thing, is a conscious experience. Likewise, the zeros and ones on a computer produce an image on a screen. Yes, only if there is a conscious mind looking at the image. Otherwise, all there is a bunch of vibrating atoms or waves or electromagnetic waves coming out of a screen. And so when somebody says, isn't consciousness emergent just like all this other stuff? All that other stuff relies on consciousness. So you've actually still only got this one thing in the universe called consciousness, which allegedly emerges. And all of these analogies actually sort of presuppose the very thing they're trying to analogize. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but can I make some distinctions here?
Please.
We have to be careful when we use the word consciousness, because in Anglophone philosophy, this tends to be separated from the questions of intentionality, unity of apprehension, because there is a sort of divide and conquer approach. If you can break these down to discrete faculties, you can show how each of them in isolation is a mechanistic part. Now, my argument in the book, and I think argument of better philosophers than I, there's a moment of false humility there, but the argument of others is that mental agency isn't dissoluble that way into discrete faculties. That's just a façon de parler, and we use it to talk about this. So it's not just consciousness, it's intentionality. It's understanding meaning as. Now, you want to talk about temperature. It's easier to say, well, that could just be, a purely functionalist way of saying it. It's a form of data processing in which the illusion of, or the epiphenomenon of experience, or not the epiphenomenon, but the functional token of experience has a part to play. I find that wrong already, because I think to recognize anything as anything, even a sensation, there's always a prior engagement of intentionality. There's no such thing as consciousness that's pure patiency, that's pure. So that you've always got, already, you start from an ontological deficit in your description. Something primal to the experience is being emitted from your description. With the image on the screen, yeah, obviously, I mean, this is a purely hermeneutical transaction at this point. It's not just that you're receiving data. You are seeing as because you're intending as a certain meaning. Otherwise, yes, all you have are photoelectric events, or even that's too descriptive. That's too thick a description for what's actually going on. But it's and remember the image. Well, I'll give you another example. Optical illusions, say the rabbit duck.
Mm-hmm.
And is what looked at these is that you can tell yourself to see it as one or the other, right? Which should surprise you. The optical illusions are, I think, much more of a challenge for the materialist view of functionalism, especially, than we give them credit for being. Dennett would say, well, here's the purpose of having this ability. But again, that doesn't explain away the preposterous notion that intentionality is an illusion of the intentional stance. And so, yes, these metaphors, I don't remember that sentence from Thomas Nagel's book. I do remember all the nasty things that were said about him for pointing out some rather humbly obvious things by people who saw him as an apostate from the Church of Materialism, like Steven Pinker. Not to be nasty, but Thomas Nagel is far better philosopher than Steven Pinker. It's just that's like saying the sky is higher than the grass, from my perspective. Well, I mean, Pinker's not a philosopher really, anyway, except in a sense. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We're always dependent on. I've had people say, "Well, the mind just works like television." Just as the camera sends images to the screen there, the mind, the world uses the data processing of neurology to send images to whom? Who's watching? Who's looking? It's an intending agency, And so we're not really getting closer to an explanation, because I'm pretty sure the television isn't watching itself.
Yes, yeah. That's the thing. It's like the consciousness needs to be embedded in, because we're so used to consciousness, because like we can't but use our consciousness when we think, when we imagine like the TV or something, we almost just like forget that the whole reason we can make sense of there being an image on a screen which is like made of fancy colors telling a story, like, is because we're presupposing consciousness. It's impossible. It is the sort of the old Berkeleyan point that it's impossible to conceive of like not conceiving something. And so when you really try to sort of reflect on the nature of what's actually out there, if you remove all of that conscious stuff, if you remove the color and the heat and the feeling of sponginess when you press your fingers into it, and all you're left with is the physical descriptions of the matter, nothing interesting has emerged at all. You've just got a bunch of atoms that are bumping into each other.
Yeah, and it's also a curious assumption about, again, this is, say, ontology. What is the really real? Now, admittedly, that's not a point you can settle, because, of course, the very grammar of the question is already suspect. But why would the bare distillate of physical limit conditions, and let's put this in terms of Robert Rosen's issues about life sciences. We don't have to talk about consciousness yet. Why would that be the reality, whereas the semantics of experience and of the world? Why is it? And again, as you may remember from the book, I don't, especially when I get to the conversation about information and whether information becomes a fundamental law of physics or what that would mean. I don't even like to say the bare syntax, because syntax really is something that exists only in relation to a semantic level already. I mean, again, this is my rather, I mean, Platinian, I suppose, or Vedantic notion of top-down causation. I honestly believe that the syntactic level is wholly dependent on the semantic, and the semantic on symbolic thought in a way that can't be. You can't invert that successfully. You can metaphorically, you can go some way towards making it sound plausible. I just don't think it works in the end. Why have we made the ontological decision that what does not need, the things that actually need to be explained to us? Because, of course, the phenomenon itself is not the physical action as such, right? It's not the physical event. The what it's like, just to use Nagel's language, the what it's like of that experience of temperature. And I don't mean just at a psychological level, not what it's like for you. I just mean what it's like phenomenologically from any subjective, unified vantage of intentionality and consciousness is not the same thing as the physical phenomenon. It's how these two are related that's the question we're trying to answer when we talk about things like mind, but also of life and language. And then simply saying, well, we're going to mistake Galileo's methodological bracketing and turn it into instead of metaphysics, is that we're actually saying, and this is what happens in philosophy of mind, that things that we know to be real, like intentionality and experience and unity of apprehension and so on, aren't real at all. They can either be conjured away as folk mythology, as the way and sooner or later we'll be able to reduce this to how, I don't know, enzymes are working or electrochemical processes, or, they're functionalist illusions, user interfaces. It always turns into a weird, and it all turns into eliminativism in the end anyway. And why? Why is that?
Can you just define eliminativism for our listeners?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not a regular viewer, so I don't know how often these topics come up. Eliminativism, in America, the most famous proponents are Paul and Patricia Churchland, husband and wife, not brother and sister, which says that all the things that we're in the custom of talking about, in the habit of talking about, like beliefs, intentions, desires, that's a psychological folklore that doesn't correspond to any reality. Eliminativism is the belief that we can ultimately arrive at a, first of all, neurological, but then biochemical, then chemical, and maybe ultimately a purely physical explanation of these things that does away with all these mythical creatures like beliefs, convictions, love, the what it's like of, well, you keep talking about sponginess. I'm not quite sure why that's your example. It kind of makes me a bit hardness. I prefer hardness to sponginess.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
well, that sounded rather nasty, actually. I prefer solidity. Okay.
Let's go for that.
Yeah, well, but yeah, and I mean, to me, this is taking the methodological piety of the mechanistic philosophy to a point of psychosis. And what we're told by eliminativists is that we should want this to happen because beliefs and convictions, we all recognize that these are radically insufficient and defective explanations of what's going on. And I said, I actually don't recognize that. Curiously enough, if you tell me what you believe, and I, mistaking myself for an intentional system who has therefore an understanding of the intrinsic intentionality in what you're saying to me, and moreover attributing to you through this haze of delusion that those beliefs really exist in your mind as intentions and convictions, I can predict what you might do if I challenge you on something that's fundamental to your beliefs, right? Or how you'll answer. I'm pretty sure that no physical calculus of what's going on in our bodies or in the substrate of our molecules is ever going to be able to yield that sort of predictive accuracy. So in fact, what they're calling a defective model that has to be superseded by the purely eliminativist physicalist account is in fact a phenomenologically verifiable, accurate, and extremely durable, I would say, assessment of reality. Not to say now, it doesn't mean that it's not overlaid with a certain number of misunderstandings, misapprehensions, hasty assumptions about how it works, but it most certainly, the realm of consciousness and intentionality and all that, most certainly is not a defective model that requires elimination so that we can get down to all that's really real, which is chemicals, electrical impulses, and then below that, little billiard balls striking one another in the microscopic realm.
Mm. So, what's the upshot of all of this? We've got like an inability of sort of the modern materialistic picture to account for consciousness. And so, but we sort of know consciousness is there. We experience it every day. Where does that leave us?
But again, you're just talking about the insufficiency of the materialist arguments, whereas in the book,
Yes.
I'm proposing that when you really, and obviously that's the thing that would be the hardest to do a digest form of in a few minutes, but argue that we actually have positive reasons for seeing in the structure of language and the structure of mental agency, but also in the structure of life. And the more we know, the more baffling the difference between organism and machine becomes, and the more organic life seems to violate the boundary that we want to assume tidily between mechanistic res extensa and non-mechanistic res cogitans, or the illusion of res cogitans.
So
Is
the
that,
reason
that you
why
can construct a picture of nature, and it does come closer in some ways to an Aristotelian picture of nature or Neoplatonic ontology, in which you have to posit a sort of noetic priority, sort of above the sort of diachronic realm of experience, and that there are good arguments for making the structure of mind, not necessarily a particular mind, though I think you ultimately get to that in a sense as well, if the infinite can be particular. But that you have good reasons for saying that the opposite conclusion, making mind fundamental, is true. Now, so, I mean, for me, that's the upshot, is that there's a better ontology. If you mean what's
Yes.
the moral or psychological or cultural upshot there, I can't help you, because I'm a cold soul who doesn't do pastoral talk.
Yeah, no, that is what I mean, is that I want to sort of, I ask that as a way to sort of plant a flag that the position we're at now is that we've got some good reason, and like you say, we're being necessarily brief here, but I've covered this topic enough that hopefully people will at least be able to sort of join us at this point where, okay, right, we've got this view that mind is fundamental to reality. And what I want to then ask, if that's the sort of upshot of what we've got so far, is like, what does that mean? I mean, we started with talking about what it means to say that the universe is material. There's some kind of, marbles, puppy. When we say that, the universe is sort of fundamentally mind. It's like, okay, I'm all ears. That sounds interesting, but what do you mean? Do you mean that, like, if I dig down into atoms, they're going to have consciousness? Do you mean that, like, there is one great big mind and all of our individual minds are somehow illusions, or like, how do we envision this?
Well, something more like the latter than the former. As you know, I don't believe in the sort of panpsychism in which consciousness is some sort of property like mass or spin. I mean, you are always trying to remechanize even our post-mechanistic models, because we're still really hooked on this metaphysics of stuff that we've got. That the basic truth is something, I don't know, ductile or pervasive.
But is there a problem with that view? Like, I mean, the panpsychist, of course, believes, like you do, and like I increasingly do, that that there is some kind of fundamentality to mental, substance, and they say, well, okay, I suppose mind is a fundamental aspect of reality, rather than just saying, as you have done, that you don't agree with that. Like, is there something that's particularly wrong with it in your view?
Yes. You read those parts of the book, so you're just asking this as a...
That is
I'm
is very much a job description, is asking questions I suspect I know my guest's answer to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are any number of famous problems with this, like, William James is talking about mind dust, the combination problem.
Hmm.
How is this more plausible? The notion that it's sort of like a discrete physical process that grows in intensity as it's combined and yet still exhibits the fundamental phenomena of consciousness, unity, intentionality, consciousness. Part of it, my objection to it, is that I do believe that mental agency is agency. It's an act. It can't be broken down into ingredient parts in that way and still
Mm.
be what it is. So unless we're really saying that every atom is a discrete personality and then every composite substance is too, or maybe we could be Leibnizians and just say the dominant monad in this system is operating. Um, but as a sort of second tier physicalism, in which to physicalism we add the notion of some primordial property called consciousness, I think that we're just ignoring what the phenomenon of mind, of mental agency is. I don't think it can be dissolved that way. So I think it's an implausible picture to begin with. Um, and I don't, and the more systematic coordination you get, the more problematic it becomes. The more life is a cooperative reality, the more the way mind reacts with the world out there in a harmony that's actually useful, if nothing else. The greater the systematic coordination becomes, the more impossible it seems to me plausibly to assert that there doesn't have to be, if this is what we're saying, there has to be some central, again, you get the same problem that you have with the Cartesian theater. Is there some panoptic module that's keeping it all going in the same direction or working together in these ways so that you have a coherent phenomenal realm and a rational realm and a causal realm and all these things, and that they hold together, or and I'm not talking about like the mind of God in the Malebranchian sense of just, this, all these things that really don't belong together, or just are held together in a sort of mystical occasionalism by the will of God, because again, that's just a terminal dualism. I don't find that explanatory. I believe that rather, when you say mind is fundamental, it does mean that matter is more fundamentally mental. It is mind. It's not something separate from. It is one modality by which this universal reality expresses itself. And yeah, I mean, if I could add certain moral virtues and graces to, say, a Spinozan picture of things, I'd be closer to that.
Hmm.
But yeah, I do believe that, that's the end of the book, of course, those last chapters in which I bring in Blondel and Lonergan, but also Shankara and others, to argue that the experience, first of all, of appresentative unity in us, which is anonymously the same that I think that even Kant talks about, that's not reducible to mechanical causes, and that ultimate horizon of transcendental orientations of intentionality are participations in one great act of mind. Yeah, I mean, I do believe in the mind
Hmm.
of God. Now, that doesn't, how anthropomorphic that you want to make that sound. I mean, I try to avoid, I mean, obviously, one of the great, I don't know if it's a scandal or one of the great leniencies of religious traditions is you have the philosophical traditions. So you have the schoolmen and the church fathers with philosophical training, or the Vedantists, or philosophers like Mullah Sadra or Ibn Arabi and so on, Suhrawardi and others, who think of God in terms of, the high metaphysics of classical theism and that, and then you have a tier below that of sort of bhakti or devotional or whatever, in which the imagery becomes more pictorial and more anthropomorphic, and this works its way all the way down to folk religion, where God is like your next door neighbor, and you're really trying to persuade him to give you a new Maserati or or something less, something like
Hmm.
heal a
Hmm.
melanoma or something. And so where you should fit your picture of God on that continuum, I'm not going to say, but the level of that I think is philosophically discernible is that level of classical theism, which I still find more convincing and compelling, but I also think logically solvent than the alternatives. So yeah,
Hmm.
I think that we are all in him, or in him or her, or in it. we live and move and have our being. But I will say this for religious consciousness, because of course, I also work in a theological vein times,
Mm-hmm.
and I write fiction too, so I want people to buy that, go out and buy, and things like that. But that the greatest Christian theologian of the 20th century, to my mind, was Sergei Bulgakov, and he makes very good arguments about how everything we possess as a perfection, including personality, has to be more eminently present in the ultimate, the infinite real of which we're part. And so even the personal cannot be absent from it, even if it's, almost infinitely analogically remote from how we understand persons as the little psychological critters that we are. But so, yes, long answer to a brief and pointed question. Yes, the mind of God would be my final answer to this point.
Well, can I ask you then, in rejecting the panpsychist view that you've got these little sort of orbs of consciousness, billions and billions and trillions of them that make up the universe, fair enough, but there is still this question of like, if I hold something in my hand, I often use this microphone just because it happens to be in front of me, and I start chopping it in half.
It just happens to be in front of you. Surely you put it there on purpose. I mean, don't become an eliminativist on me now.
No, I just have this thing attached to my body because I podcast so much these days. So I just look down and there it is. It is an object that's in front of me, and it is something which I can break down, and I can break down the metal into its sort of constituent atomic sort of makeup, and it does get a bit murky, right? When you talk about quantum mechanics, it's difficult to observe exactly what's going on down there. But metaphysically speaking, something must be down there. And so if our vision is like, we are participating in a great big mind rather than there's mind at the bottom out of which we're kind of made, those are kind of the two directions this often goes in.
I would not have you think that I believe that there's ever any level at which matter is mechanistic alone. So yes, I do believe there's consciousness at every level. The thing is, what I don't believe is that it can be discriminated from all the other agencies of mind and then treated as a kind of physical property that then is combined in the way we combine discrete material ingredients. That there's the nature of the unity of conscious acts is such that. But I believe that, and this is again why I'm, I suppose, sort of metaphysical monist with a high Neoplatonic or Rhineland mystic or Vedantic leaning when I'm being exotic and not writing just philosophy, is that I believe that whatever that mental agency is at those lowest levels, it too has a unity and an intentionality that may not be psychologically self-aware the way I am, but that it is participating in this one mental act that constitutes all of reality. So I'm not denying consciousness at those levels. There's no level at which I say, well, this is just mechanistic stuff. I'm to that degree, I am a dual aspect monist in that sense. It's just, I think the dual aspect monism still always begs a question. When you look at what the ultimate reality is we deal with, you're still going to end up with a depiction of whatever that lowest level reality is that tends either towards materialism or towards idealism. It just is. It's going to give a priority more to the top-down symbolic, semantic, syntactic causality than the top-up, which nonetheless is every bit as integral and every bit as original of, let's say the material potential, whatever. So I would still, say that what I would reject is the notion that there's any conceivable way, and William James's arguments are good enough for me, to be honest, of treating consciousness as just like another property, and then again segregating it from all the other phenomena of consciousness. But I do believe levels of participation. I mean, I think that there really is. If you've ever studied Hymenoptera, for instance, bees especially, the degree to which each individual bee is an integrated organic and intentional system can really be determined by they actually, it's amazing. But there's there's a book, I can't remember the author, it's called The Democracy of the Bees or something. If you look it up, fascinating the degree to which you have both a social and I don't know what else to call it, personal level here that extends both to the hive but also to each individual member. So, and I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sense in which there are all these different levels of intentionality. I believe our cells are really intentional systems. I think that more and more, whether you who's the fellow at Tufts who is a friend of Dennett's, the scientist who it's Michael Levin, I think Michael Levin. Uh, whether you see those things he calls xenobots as proof of this or not, nonetheless, since the 1930s or 1940s, we've known a great deal about how the individual cell edits its own genome, and then learned more and more transposable elements and horizontal transposition and this systematic coordination. So this act of mental intentionality that's going on in all things at all times in us achieves a certain kind of consciousness. But that consciousness isn't the whole story because things are also going on in our bodies below the threshold of consciousness. I'm not aware of what every cell in my body is doing, what every intellect, and well above it, I would say as well, that the mind it can ascend, this sort of mystical experience of ascending to that, if you like, noetic level is real as well. But in most daily consciousness, I'd say, we participated in a certain way, and as individual psychological persons, this organisms, we participate in it within a certain modality, and we have a certain psychological experience of our consciousness. But that's part of a flowing river, it's part of an ocean, and every part is in some degree part of this moving act of thought from the infinite oneness of God to the infinite fullness of God.
Yeah, the
There, I
questions.
went right off the rails, right into
No.
religion.
That's good because that's where we want to end up, right? Essentially, but the questions that spring to mind for me for clarification here are: you said, there's consciousness at the level of ourselves, and then you said, but there's also stuff below the level of consciousness, like, say, the cell. Do you mean to say that those cells are sort of somehow made up of mentality but are not conscious, or do you think there's some kind of
No,
consciousness
I
in the
don't.
cell?
I mean, what I don't know what consciousness is well enough in its. I think there has to
Right.
be a level of consciousness, and I mean that's why people like James Shapiro
Hmm.
speak of cells as sentient, at least
Right.
sentient
Okay.
systems, and so they have intentionality. And what is consciousness? Well, they do respond and they do coordinate to a surprising. It's amazing, but also that coordination, of course, is in some communication with me because it's my knowledge of my environment, phenomenological but psychological, presumably as well, which will be part of what instructs my cells for the need to adapt the genome to new
Hmm.
conditions. Maybe use transposable elements. I mean, there has to be some level at which the awareness of a grasshopper, awareness of a certain privation of available protein makes the cells aware that they have to change the grasshopper into a locust because this is one and the same species, just in different gene expressions, different epigenetic realizations of one and the same genomic sequence.
Hmm.
So I assume that there is a cooperation, a coordination of sorts with my own awareness that I'm part of this system. So, but
Hmm.
are my cells, is each individual cell conscious in some sense?
Yeah.
But
Right.
I don't
Okay.
believe that consciousness is univocal. As I say, I don't take the Cartesian view that it's all one thing, that there are levels. So I much prefer something like the Neoplatonic notion of, the one, the nous, psyche, soul, creating life and all that, or the Aristotelian notion of the rational soul, the vegetative soul, and or Platonic notion of sort of the chariot driver of Themos, and so I don't. Again, I'm not a Cartesian in any sense. I do believe there is a cooperative continuum here,
Hmm.
and that every level participates to some degree in this mental act that is consciousness, intentionality, unity, finality.
I, I guess in trying to place this
I
in
think that
context.
explains life systems to
Yeah.
I think Robert Rosen and James Shapiro, in their different ways, are onto something, and Dennis Noble, and in a different way, Evan Thompson. I disagree with him on
Yeah.
Well,
I wanted to ask, like, being sort of in a sort of context of being sort of contra panpsychism here, still, if you were to fundamentally cut down into reality, into what we call material objects, right, and keep sort of digging down in there, and you said, I want to be clear that there's no point of like digging down where mentality or consciousness isn't present anymore. What I wanted to ask is, do you think, and maybe the answer is just, I don't know, but maybe you have a hunch, like, do you think that you would hit some kind of rock bottom, that there is some kind of foundational unit of stuff, and if there is such a thing, what would you suppose it to be? In the way that a string theorist says it's a vibrating string, and somebody might say, oh, it's just a fundamental particle, like an electron or a muon. Would you say, given that there is no point at which consciousness is not present, although the universe doesn't sort of come out of these individual conscious units, would you still be looking at it in the sort of super ultra microscope? Would you still be looking at something like a fundamental unit of consciousness or something else?
Well, I don't think a microscope would be able to see the actual consciousness. I would expect
the metaphysical microscope.
I mean, at the lowest level, the dreams of God. I don't know precisely there. I just know that. Let me put it this way: just as when you phenomenologically take apart mental agency, or perhaps the systematic coordination of organism as opposed to mechanistic, replicating organisms especially, or the structure of language, you can identify a syntactic or a paratactic or a material level, but at no point does it exist in abstraction from the total act that has that intentional finality, that antecedent finality in it, and in that formal structure. And so at that lowest level of whatever physical reality is, I would say the same thing, is that whatever the mentality there is, it exists by virtue of its participation in this already or supereminent downward causation. And so it is first and foremost an act of mind, even if it's also material. Now, so I'm not anti-panpsychist. I want to point out, I don't reject panpsychism as such, because it's a huge term. I mean, in that, I can't remember. I'm having horrible trouble with names today. Forgive me, Jim. But panpsychism has been used to describe the dominant philosophy of antiquity and the Middle Ages and everything up to modernity. So all I'm rejecting is a panpsychism that's become just, as I say, captivated by the metaphysics of stuff to the degree that it's remechanizing. It's trying to get past mechanism by, again, just creating another mechanistic picture. I think the paradigm is defective. It's always going to turn into an infinite regress if you do that. But you mean, do I understand the mind of God? No. But I think we have more than enough good reason to think that what the mind does is not an epiphenomenal froth on the surface of a vast ocean of pure, mindless material energy.
Yes, I can agree with that. And I suppose, because, you've taken a lot of your time here, but there's just one more sort of question, or like body of questions, that I just have to get your thoughts on, I think, to give a complete picture to the viewer here, which is that, okay, so maybe we're dealing with a kind of idealism, or a kind of pantheism, or a kind of panentheism, and in some sense, our selves are just these consciousnesses that are participating in a great big consciousness, and in the same way, all physical matter is really somehow part of this big sort of mental act. You still are left with, I think, two important questions. One is this: if one of the sort of characteristics of mentality and consciousness is its like unity, the fact that, when I have a conscious experience, it feels unified and singular to me, it's not made up of parts, it's like this one sort of thing altogether. If we are all existing in the mind of God, then why do we not all exist in this one great big sort of abstract sort of singular thought? Why does it feel like there's a me and there's a you and there's a him and a her, and like there's all this distinction going on within this
Why,
great big mind?
yeah, but why wouldn't there be modalities within it? Because my contention would be that we aren't psychologically circumvallated by our individuality, that even the premises of what our thinking is, as I said before, when you retreat to that appresentative unity that Kant talks about, but which I would prefer to call, Nous or the Funklein or the Atman or whatever,
Mm.
you find that it's perfectly anonymous in a sense. It isn't your psychological self. You can distinguish your empirical ego from the pure I think. And also, if my description of intentionality in the book is correct, and don't tell anyone, but it is, the ultimate horizon of all intentionality exceeds again anything that's characteristic of you simply as a self. Why there shouldn't be modalities or sort of these prismatic reductions to, well, wouldn't that too be part of an infinite thought, and infinite thought in all its possible facets would express? I mean, I do have the sympathy with Spinoza's thinking, yeah, infinite substance and infinite modes is necessary. You can't separate the many from the one if you make the infinite devoid of the richness of diverse experience. So I assume that there's not really, again, at this point though, I'm not going to take the preposterous sort of Hegelian position that I can actually know the real in a full rational and encompassing thought. I mean, and if that's a caricature of Hegel, I apologize to his guest. But there is that tendency there. I'm not trying to build a system with anything quite like that architectonic fullness, but I have no problem seeing, the subjective experience of consciousness at my level, and at a different level, perhaps, of the cells in my epigastrium, or in cerebral cortices, as participating in different ways. Because I think that we again and again happen upon grounds of unity that we share. And again, I do think the experiences of contemplatives and mystics are illuminating here, or perhaps persons on psychedelics. These all may be derangements, okay? But there's a certain uniformity and unanimity to this experience of the loss of self in a greater self, and the loss of finite empirical horizons in a more embracing, a sense of, experience of the infinite. To me, it would be an impoverished infinite, so to speak, infinite simplicity that whose rational content were not also infinite diversity.
I think that makes sense, and I suppose to really make this clear, I want to ask, and my final question.
Am I
I'll
God?
let you go.
I know. Yes.
No, although
like Kojève's argument about Hegel, wasn't it? That if you follow Hegel to the end, he's actually saying that he's more Jesus than Jesus was.
Yeah,
he's
quite.
More God than
No,
God
that's not. I actually kind of want to go in the opposite direction and say, okay, so I've talked about that enough that without going into too much detail, I hope our listeners will understand this idea that maybe this sort of individuation of the self that we're talking about as being this slight mystery is not even real. There's not like a real distinction between selves. It's just sort of an illusion.
Well, it's certainly not absolute. I mean, I think it's real in that it's a real phenomenon that we are. I can't taste the coffee you're drinking.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's absolute. I mean, I think there are experiences where we break through those boundaries.
There is something weird, and it takes us right back to the beginning, before anybody has ever thought about consciousness. There is something that everybody notices, which is like, I've got a book here. It's a book by Rodney Stark. I use it to prop up my laptop. And I maybe
Rodney. So,
I know, poor Rodney. Maybe for Christ, actually, there's a picture of him on the front. That's probably a bit blasphemous, but it was unintentional. If anybody's,
I don't like the
anybody's watching.
sociological arguments in the book all that much. Some of them are true, but they're too deflationary for me. So,
Yeah, well, there's a lot to be said on Rodney Stark, and perhaps that's a podcast in itself. But he's serving as a useful placeholder here. Not talking about Rodney Stark, I'm sure that he's conscious just as I am. But I mean to say the book, right? I will notice that even though maybe I am just this thing which participates in a great big mind. Likewise, this book, being made of matter, is really just something which is participating in a great big mental act, and we're all just participating in this mental act of God, the mind of God. And yet, I've got something that this book doesn't have, right? And it's not just in the way that I've got something you don't have. I've got a singular mustache, and you're wearing glasses, that kind of thing. But I've got this extra thing, which typically we associate with something like the word consciousness. Now, we want to say that's maybe a mistake.
oh no, it's not a
So then?
mistake. Consciousness, just don't separate it from the other aspects of the mental act. It is consciousness. Yeah.
So what is it if I and this book are both just these things which exist in one great big mind? What is it that I have that the book doesn't have, that you and I share that the book doesn't have?
Well, I guess a rational and an animal and a vegetal nature, a soul, if you're going to be Aristotelian about it. But how does the book exist, though? What is its ontology? What is the book? It exists as atoms. It exists as a composite of pulp and polymers and other things, and of inks.
Mm-hmm.
But the book also consists in its intentional content, right? Which exists only because it's in relation to you. So it's a medium, it's a form of uttered word of intentional communion and communication. And in that regard, there's a level even of the book that exists outside its physical calculus, that exists instead in this hermeneutical or noetic space. Why? Again, for a panpsychist who's materialist, that's more of an issue, I would think, because they're thinking the atoms of the book have to add up into something, whereas I don't think that. If there's a level of consciousness at the level of matter as part of the greater whole, and it serves its part there as the physical vehicle or platform by which a spiritual, using that in the sort of geistlich, the German sense, spiritual or mental reality of Rodney writing down, communicating something, and you communicating it, and you receiving it hermeneutically at the level of semiotics and intentional meaning. It participates at many different levels. It doesn't it's not, its part in the whole is not that of an organism, no, but it's certainly part of the whole continuum of the mental agency that composes all things. Again, if you think about panpsychism in terms of a metaphysics of stuff, yeah, I think that's an interesting question, but that's not how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I get what you're saying about the book and the language of the book, but suppose it was just like a rock or maybe a leaf from a tree or something. Yeah, a leaf is very complex. A brain is very complex. The materialist typically says that there's something about the complex organization of the brain that gives rise to consciousness. Your view seems to be no, that consciousness gives rise to something like the brain. Consciousness also gives rise to something like a leaf. Is it just a difference in the complexity of the arrangement of consciousness? Is it
intensity?
what is it that gives one?
But consciousness isn't arranged. I mean, again, you're talking about a materialist bad day. At that point, you're talking about how does the composite work? But the reason I was talking about honeybees earlier, it's a good example of what I mean. There is a hive mind. There is such a thing, curiously enough. It works, again, at a profoundly semiotic level, but also at a level that involves decision and debate. When a colony gets to the side where it wants to, which it needs a second hive, all right, certain bees go out and search and take in the lay of the land, And then they have a sort of coded way of communicating this that's choreographed and apparently audible as well, that communicates what the differences are. Now, what happens is that bit by bit, as this parliament undertakes its deliberations, more and more bees begin sharing the dance of the bee that ultimately, whose choice is the most useful and the one that they agree on. Right. Well, on the one hand, bees are more conscious, I believe, than the cells in their bodies. And yet, in a sense, the hive has a kind of mental agency that depends on some, I would say, also unified ground and unified. And so, I have no knowledge of where the difference between the singular and the collective has to be drawn, how consciousness unfolds itself. I do know what the phenomenon of consciousness is to some degree in myself and others. I can observe it, I can describe it, and the phenomenology is a very useful thing. And in doing so, I discover again these what seem to me indissoluble simples regarding unity and intentionality and so on and so forth. What I'm not proposing, certainly, is that, again, it's like, consciousness is like a light in the room, and the more photons you have in the room, the brighter it is. I think that there are all sorts of integrations and integrities and systems at work, all different sorts of interweavings. I like Dennis Noble's talk of the music of life. He's a violinist as well, and the special fondness for the contrapuntal tradition. So, but I say this: the question you're asking, I think, is again, it's taking us back to a model where I have to account for a composite phenomenon built up from smaller things that would be like particles of consciousness, and that I don't believe. I believe there is this. I guess, since we have to talk in metaphors at this point, I guess it would be rather like light pouring through a prism in which the simplicity of the undifferentiated light becomes plural, but then ultimately again merges into the whole in a different way. Yeah, I don't know if I can give you an answer more than that. I mean, I think you're an organism and the book isn't. What's interesting to me about the book is even it exists within hierarchies of ontological hierarchies. It exists as an
yes.
What your cat might make of the book. It's a different object for the cat than it is for you.
Yes. That's true. What do you think makes, say, the brain a special instrument? I mean, the brain, whether you're a materialist or an idealist or anything, quite clearly the brain is like the center of my ego. There's got to be something that's important about it, and yet we want to say, but consciousness is not the same thing as the brain. That's a materialistic reductionist view. So, but the brain's got to be doing something special. What do you think is the role of the brain?
It is a form of matter, a modality of mind that is specifically appropriate to the complexity of the sort of mentality, the sort of organism you have. I don't think what's special about it is that it is formed by. That's the funny thing. You say it's the center of your ego. Well, maybe the center of your psychological ego in some sense, but the I think in a different way. I think is the center of the brain. It creates, it forms, and it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the things that's very odd. I found this when reading David Chalmers' last book. These fantasies of uploading consciousness onto a digital platform and all that, is they don't seem to take into account the degree to which mental agency actually shapes the organism. That it's not. This is odd sort of inverted Cartesianism in which the mind is just code and the physical vehicle is simply, fungible. It could be silicon. It could be. So, well, no. We know a lot about neuroplasticity. We know a lot about laying down new neural pathways, and that's often the result of conscious agency, so that we know the mind forms the brain at least that level of dynamic organization in the course of the history of an organism.
Mm.
I think that in a more primordial sense, mind is always doing that. The brain is the form taken by that which is formed by mind for human mentality. Um,
Yes.
but we keep
Well,
inverting. It's funny how we always this is the heritage of the 17th century. What is the
yes.
stuff? What is the mechanical process that allows for the seemingly more than mechanical reality rather than the way and Hephaestus in my book, I think, poses that as well as I could make him do. And he
Yes.
doesn't give up in the end, I will point out. Um, but, to me, the inverse of that question, the one that the ancient world asked, for them, matter and embodiment was stranger than mind because they could see the structure of mind in everything. Everything seemed to have a finality and to be coordinated with other realities and to be available to mental reflection in a way that seemed more than accidental or extrinsic. For them, the question would be, how did mind become this? How did
Mm.
this reduced, prismated or congealed or coalesced form emerge from this primordial reality, which is mind in all things? And
Yeah.
perversely enough, I guess I'm just pre-modern in this. I regard that question as ultimately probably the one that starts from a better rational intuition.
Mm. Can I ask you? I promise it was the last question, but it just sprang to mind, and I think it's unavoidable here. What then? And this might help to really get at this mistake that you think I keep making conversationally here, but that society is
Oh, it's
making as a
not a
whole.
mistake. It's a bondage of the reason, but not a mistake. Yeah.
It, it's my intentional materialistic devil's advocate coming out. But what do you think? So given that consciousness sort of precedes its individual manifestation in like a human brain or something, and
Mind,
people
mind.
typically think that people typically a materialist thinks that consciousness is reducible to the brain, such that when I die, my brain is going to rot and then my consciousness will switch off. Presumably, in your view, when we die, consciousness doesn't exactly go anywhere, but this thing that the brain is the center of, the ego, the I am, the self, what do you think happens to not consciousness, as people often frame this question, where does consciousness go after death, but the consciousness that I have as opposed to the consciousness that you have, the fact that I can taste the iron brew that I've been drinking and you can't, what happens to that when my biological organism shuts down?
You notice you said my ego, my I am, myself, as if these were all synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
The ego and ego sum are two different things. And self, there's a contested question. Do you mean psychological or spiritual self? Do you mean
Mm-hmm.
Jiva or Atman? Do you mean?
Mm.
But your question's much simpler than that, so I won't try to get around it with pedantries. Um, the I am, I think, is primordial. No, obviously I think it persists. I think that not because I have a pathetic desire for immortality. I'm 60 years old now. I know I look much younger, 35 at most, but believe it or not, I'm 60. And when you reach a certain age, the idea of oblivion is less appalling than it is when you're young. You have more pains. You've lost more people and pets along the way. You've become more keenly aware of the sufferings of this world and others and children and animals and the innocent. And so I don't think that's it. I've just had experiences that convince me that it goes on. I don't mean a near-death experience. The one time I was nearly killed, I don't recall anything else happening until I woke up again. But I don't think I was ever actually clinically dead. I was just hit by a car. Um, but I've had other experiences that here we get into the fantastic in many people's minds. If I started talking about them, that's autobiographical and some of it's
Mhm,
private.
mhm.
But yeah,
Of
I mean, I
course.
believe it goes on. And I do, when I take off this hat and put on the other, when I write books of theology, that's based on a set of other convictions based not only on logic or philosophy as I understand them, but on what I believe about certain historical events, certain personal events. And so short answer is, yeah, I believe in, I guess, what you'd call the immortality of the soul. That to the degree to which, though, that you're the ego that you are,
That's what I wanted
that
to ask.
well, I mean, there's the I am that is still finite, longing to become infinite. I think. I mean, I think that's all the acts of our reason and intentionality do stretch out to a desire to be one with the infinite, but that it's still an individual experience that, if my favorite 4th century thinker, Gregory of Nyssa, was right, expands ever towards the infinite. But, that's just one picture of all of our pictures are children's daubs.
Well, yeah.
But I
So
think that
when
there
you
are
say it
aspects
goes
of your,
on,
there are aspects of your ego that you'd want to be freed from too, right? I mean, you're
yeah, right.
also a psychological self. You're young. How old are you?
I'm
20.
26.
Okay. That's old enough to have done things that you regret. Hurt people perhaps you didn't want to hurt, been selfish in ways you didn't want to be selfish. I'm not accusing you in particular, though I've heard some awful things about you, just absolutely awful. But there are presumably aspects of that of which you want to be liberated. I mean, there's a part
Of
of the
course.
self that is a transient psychological phenomenon that I like to think is, if not probationary, that's part of the crucible in which we're immersed in nature and time and history and self, and that not all of that persists, and that what we shall be has not yet been revealed. But I don't think that there's a point where that you, as this I am, that is this pure point of perspective with this history, is ever extinguished. I think it moves on, though, from glory to glory, ideally, even if it has to go through other things to that. And there, however, we're straying beyond the realm of philosophy. I'm not like
Yes.
Ficino, or I think Kant is right that you can't, from recognition of the irreducibility of the I am, get to the traditional arguments for the immortality of a soul substance. I think philosophy has very little to say, except to say that there are plausible ways where it would be consistent with our experience of consciousness. We're not bound to a mechanistic view of consciousness. But beyond that, I don't think there's a philosophical argument that's worth pursuing.
It wouldn't have any specific shape, in other words. It's like, look, some good reason to think that mentality or consciousness, or maybe even some semblance of the I am.
Well, no, maybe who you are,
continues.
maybe who you more truly are. The degree to which what you are, who you are, is dispensable, obviously is different from tradition to tradition. Within even Bhaktic Hinduism, not Vedanta, a great deal of what you would consider to be who you are is just a vehicle for who you truly are. The true self, the Atman, is not bound even to one lifetime, right? If you're in the Jewish or Muslim or Christian continuum, you might think, well, no, there's also a web of particular relationships, that who I am is actually bound to the history of the life I've lived here, who I truly am, and that web of communion and relationships not going to be just realized in some impossibly remote future in which I've been many other persons along the way, but that there's a depth to personhood that persists more obdurately or more beautifully than that. And again, I don't pretend that philosophy can adjudicate here.
So, speaking as a philosopher, you might say something like, I do believe that whatever it is we're talking about there goes on in some sense, but what sense that is in which it goes on is an ungraspable aspect of reality. I think
That's a perfectly fair statement. Yeah, that's a perfectly fair précis.
I think that's fair enough, and perhaps also a good and relatively optimistic, which is sometimes I think it's quite rare for this channel to end on a relatively optimistic note.
Well, who knows? It might be a really boring afterlife. It might, just be endless reruns of bad British comedies from the 1970s. Are you being served? Well, okay, if Marty Feldman maybe. Okay. But all right.
Well, I guess we'll find out when we get there. David Bentley Hart, thank you so much for your time.
It's good to meet you. Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you might like my previous episode with Philip Goff, a panpsychist philosopher who semi-recently converted to a form of self-admittedly heretical Christianity involving a God who's not omnipotent. You can watch that by clicking the link that's on your screen. To support my work and get early ad-free access to episodes, subscribe to my Substack at alexoconnor.com. Thanks for watching.